You're not hearing a machine gun, you're hearing a psychological weapon. In the chaos of battle, German soldiers gave it a name that had nothing to do with its caliber or its design. They called it the Buzzsaw of Hell, because before its 50 caliber rounds ever hit you, the sound alone, that brutal, ripping, tearing sound, would crawl inside your mind and break your will to fight. This is the story of why the M2 Browning's roar was more feared than its bite. The morning was cold enough to sting through the wool of a soldier's coat. A pale mist rolled over a nameless French village, smothering sound and color alike. The German patrol moved in silence, slow, wary, with rifles raised and eyes flicking through shattered windows. Somewhere far away, a single crow cried, and then all was still. And then it came. Not a shot, not even a burst, a sound. A metallic scream ripped through the air, a thunderclap of fury that made the very stones tremble. It was not the high crack of a rifle or the rhythmic bark of a machine gun. It was deeper, angrier, a roar that seemed torn from the bowels of the earth itself, the guttural breath of something not human. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the second roar came. It shredded the air. Bullets dug into the street like teeth biting into flesh. Dust exploded from brick walls, helmets rang like church bells, and a young infantryman fell as if an invisible hand had erased him from existence. Panic broke the silence. The squad scattered, shouting over the deafening chorus of fire, a hellish rhythm that rolled across the ruins like the growl of an unleashed beast. It was the first time the soldiers of the Wehrmacht met the M2 Browning, and they had no name for what they were hearing. Some called it thunder. Others whispered that it was the devil laughing. But soon, very soon, a phrase would spread through the ranks like wildfire. Die Höllensäge, the hell saw. The weapon's bullets cut through the air at nearly 900 meters per second, faster than sound could carry their warning. Vehicles that once offered shelter now burst apart, metal frames sliced as if by a giant's invisible saw. Every burst lasted a second, but to those beneath it, it felt eternal. The gun did not shoot, it screamed. One young officer later wrote in his diary, "It is not a gun, it breathes. It lives and devours." His words were scratched onto damp paper, the ink blurred by rain or fear, perhaps both. Another soldier described it as a saw of fire, cutting down entire squads in mere seconds. They would learn its name only later, when captured manuals and interrogations revealed the truth. The Americans called it Browning's M250 caliber. To those on the receiving end, it was a machine forged in hell. Imagine standing there, the ground vibrating under your boots, ears ringing, the world narrowed to that monstrous voice. You try to raise your weapon, but your instincts rebel. Every sense in your body screams to run. The sound alone crushes you before a bullet even touches flesh. You are no longer fighting a soldier. You are standing inside a storm powered by steel and hatred. In the following weeks, units across northern France began reporting the same terrifying noise. Unusual heavy fire, continuous, with immense velocity. Reports crossed desks. Officers argued whether it was a new type of automatic cannon or modified aircraft gun. None could explain how something so small could rip apart armored vehicles with such ease. Even tank crews began to fear its sting, armor-penetrating rounds tearing through plating like paper. The myth was growing. Stories spread faster than reason. Some claimed that the gun never jammed, that it ate belts of ammunition endlessly, roaring until nothing moved. Others said it could cut down an oak tree with a single burst, that its bullets left holes wide enough to see daylight through a man's chest. Soldiers began drawing crude pictures in their notebooks, a monstrous weapon spitting fire, its barrel smoking like the open mouth of some metallic dragon. This fear was a weapon in itself, and fear, once born in war, becomes immortal. Yet behind that roar, behind that claimed saw of hell, stood not a demon, but a man, a quiet, meticulous genius who had spent his life building instruments of precision. The soldiers who trembled at his creation would never know his face, never read his blueprints. His machine, however, would speak for him in a language louder than any voice. In that fog-drenched village, as the echoes faded into the distance and the survivors counted the missing, a truth crystallized in every trembling hand that still gripped a rifle. They had just met an invention that would change the music of war itself. The M2 Browning was not merely an instrument of death. It was a new language of fear, a promise that no shelter would be enough, no armor thick enough, no man fast enough. And so, the legend began. The roar from nowhere had found its name. From that day on, whenever the air vibrated with that unholy rhythm, the soldiers would whisper, "It's the saw again." And they would pray, not for victory, but for silence. Before M2 roared across Europe, before its barrel spat thunder into the gray skies of France, there was silence. A silence broken only by the rhythmic tap of metal, the whisper of files, and the quiet patience of a man in his workshop. John Moses Browning was not born among generals or machinists. He was born among wind and wilderness, in the small town of Ogden, Utah, in the year 1855. The West still smelled of dust and freedom then. America was building, dreaming, and arming itself for the future. Yet even in his boyhood, John saw machines not as tools, but as living things waiting to be shaped. His father, Jonathan Browning, was a blacksmith and gunsmith, a man who forged iron by hand and faith. John learned to hold a chisel before he learned to write his name. He grew up amidst the music of hammers and the scent of oil, believing that perfection was not found in wealth or rank, but in the balance of steel and purpose. When other children carved wooden swords, John took apart his father's rifles, not out of rebellion, but out of reverence. He wanted to know their secrets. By the time he was 23, he had built his first working firearm from scrap. It was crude, ugly even, but it worked like a promise, and once that spark ignited, it never died. Over the next 4 decades, Browning's hands would sketch the future of warfare: revolvers, shotguns, semi-automatics, each a step closer to his ultimate vision. A weapon not bound by the rhythm of man, but by the rhythm of mechanics. Every machine he built was a conversation with the possible. Each screw, each lever, each spring was a word in a private language between man and metal. He was fascinated by the idea of continuity, of motion without interruption. To him, a gun wasn't a thing meant simply to kill. It was a challenge to design something that worked in harmony with the laws of nature: recoil, gas, resistance, the universe's own mechanics put into the service of precision. In the early 20th century, the armies of the world were changing. Horses were giving way to engines, swords to bullets, courage to industrial math, and Browning stood in the middle of this transformation, not as a politician or soldier, but as an architect of the inevitable. Then came his masterpiece, the heavy machine gun that would later thunder its name into history. It began as a simple concept drawn on parchment, a belt-fed 50 caliber weapon capable of tearing through steel plates and enemy aircraft alike. To most, that idea was madness. To John Moses Browning, it was just physics. He worked relentlessly in his modest shop, a place without banners or uniforms, only workbenches and metal filings glistening like frost. His assistants remembered his peculiar silence, how he could stand for hours, hands on his hips, staring at a half-assembled receiver, lost in thought. When the right idea finally struck him, His whole body would move as if struck by lightning. He would grab a wrench or scratch a new line onto the blueprint without saying a word. He believed that the key to mastery was listening to the metal. "It tells you everything," he once said softly. "You just have to be quiet long enough." Then came the Great War. The first time mankind heard the world scream through the barrels of machine guns. The battlefield had changed, but Browning's designs were ready long before the generals were. The U.S. Army adopted his .45 caliber pistol, a weapon that became legend in the trenches. Yet John was already looking past it into a new dimension of power. He saw the future in the air. When airplanes became the new predators of war, Browning understood that only fire could stop fire. The infantry needed a weapon that could bring down steel birds and tear through armor. So he scaled up everything he knew: the recoil systems, the locking mechanisms, the precision timing, until he had something enormous and terrifying. By 1918, he was testing what would become the M2. The prototype was ungainly, a brute of metal with a soul of genius. Each test shot roared like a small cannon. The ground beneath the range shuddered as the gun spat lines of flame into targets hundreds of meters away. Military observers watched in stunned silence. One of them simply muttered, "It doesn't miss." Browning himself said little. He stood beside his creation, tall, calm, bespectacled, with soot on his sleeves, as if listening to an old hymn. When he spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "It will do." He was 55 years old then. His hair had begun to gray, but his eyes burned with the same fierce light that first flickered in that Utah workshop decades before. Destiny had finally caught up with him. He never saw his masterpiece unleashed on the battlefields of Europe. He died in 1926 at his workbench, still wearing his apron, a screwdriver in his hand. It was as though the machine had taken its first breath only to steal the breath of its creator. But death could not silence him, because every thunderous echo of M2, every burst that tore through the clouds, carried his name, not in words, but in vibration, in terror, in awe. His homeland was not a place on any map. It was a sound, the sound of fire made perfect. And though John Browning's heart had stopped, his invention would pulse for another century, its voice whispering across every war that followed. I was built by a man who listened to the silence. The workshop smelled of oil, smoke, and prophecy. In the center stood a machine that defied language, a sculpture of steel and purpose, neither beautiful nor crude, but something beyond both. It was the Browning .50 caliber M2, and it seemed almost alive. Those who first saw it in the years after the Great War did not know what to think. To the untrained eye, it was nothing but mass and menace, a heavy barrel, a thick receiver, a feeding belt of massive cartridges that looked closer to artillery shells than bullets. Soldiers joked that it would take a giant to carry it. Engineers muttered that it was excessive. Generals frowned and said the same words humanity always utters before a new era begins: "It's too much." But what is too much when the future is already knocking on the door? John Browning's invention, his final masterpiece, had crossed the boundary of what people then considered possible. The M2 was not simply bigger than the guns of its time, it was smarter. It was built like a mathematical equation, every spring and lever tuned to the rhythm of recoil, harnessing its own violence to reload itself flawlessly. Each round fired created the power for the next, a perfect cycle, an endless loop of motion and destruction. Weapons of the early 20th century were still learning how to breathe. The M2 exhaled like a storm. Even in its early tests, the weapon behaved like no other. Its firing rate was constant, about 500 rounds per minute, but what made it terrifying was its stability. While other guns overheated or jammed, the M2 just kept roaring, precise, relentless, balanced, as if the hand of its creator still guided every shot. Engineers tried to find its limits. The gun met every challenge with mechanical indifference. It was, simply put, an apex predator of design. By the time the weapon reached the U.S. Army proving grounds, Browning himself had already passed away. His son, Val, stood beside the weapon during the first demonstrations, watching the machine speak in the only voice it knew: steel on air. The clouds of dust rose, the echoes bounced against the canyon walls, and a hush fell over the observers. Somewhere in that roar, they could feel the presence of the man who had built it, a ghost who still whispered through gears and barrels. Soon, the weapon became a revelation. Airmen saw in it a guardian that could strike at distant aircraft. Infantry saw a shield against advancing armor. Each branch of the military claimed a piece of it, shaping it to their needs. The Browning was mounted on jeeps, trucks, boats, aircraft, fortresses. It was the first weapon that transcended categories. It could cut through enemy trucks, shred aircraft fuselages, pierce tank armor, and silence distant bunkers. Not one other machine gun in the world matched its range, its fury, or its cold precision. The M2 was more than a gun. It was a new kind of heartbeat for mechanized war. Yet, the world was slow to understand what it had been given. When the Second World War began, many armies still clung to outdated beliefs that speed and maneuver could replace firepower. Then came the shock. As American bombers roared over Europe, the twin wings lined with M2s spat light and death into the skies. The noise they made was unforgettable, deep, rhythmic, and unending. For enemies on the ground, it was a sound associated with helplessness. For pilots behind the trigger, it was the symphony of survival. German and Japanese engineers studied captured Browning guns in disbelief. The craftsmanship was unnerving. Pieces fitted so precisely that even dust could not betray them. When disassembled on the battlefield, the gun could be cleaned and reassembled by a single soldier in total darkness. Few machines had ever been built with such intimate understanding of their user. There was a quiet perfection in its brutality. It did exactly what it was meant to do, and nothing else. Not a gram of excess, not a wasted motion. It was the embodiment of Browning's lifelong obsession: efficiency as beauty. Some soldiers came to believe the gun possessed a soul. It almost felt that way. In war, when everything else jammed, the radios, the trucks, even courage, the M2 did not. It stayed, breathing its metallic rhythm into the chaos. One soldier wrote home, "When it fires, you feel safe. When it stops, you start praying." That was the paradox of the Browning, a man's masterpiece that made men fear their own hands. Because this gun did not belong solely to its time. It belonged to every time that would follow. Even now, long after the thunder of mid-century wars fades into the static of history, the M2 remains in service. Little has changed. The shape is the same. The soul is untouched. It stands as proof that genius, once forged, never rusts. More than 100 years after John Browning first drew its outline, the weapon still roars. And in that roar, in that endless chain of recoil and precision, you can almost hear the echo of the workshop in Utah, the whisper of a man who built tomorrow with his hands. The world caught up to his vision, eventually. But for decades, he was the future, a machine ahead of its time. The first time the M2 Browning spoke in battle, the world listened. It was 1932, in the dry heart of Central America. The sun hammered the jungle, and the U.S. Marines moved through shadows, sweating, swatting at insects, waiting. Their heavy new gun sat on a tripod at the edge of the clearing, unfamiliar, almost ominous. The men called it the Big 50. None of them yet knew it would become the sound of the next century. When the ambush came, it came like lightning. Rebels broke through the trees with shouts and the echo of old rifles. The Marines returned fire, chaotic, frantic, until the gunner on the tripod leaned forward, squeezed the trigger, and history changed. The air split open. A single belt of cartridges turned the clearing into thunder. The M2's barrel glowed red. Smoke blossomed into the sky. Every second, a storm of bullets that tore through trunks, splintered wood, dropped men mid-step. The earth shuddered with each metallic heartbeat. In less than a minute, the attack was over. Only silence and smoke remained. When it stopped, the Marines stared at the weapon like men staring at something sacred. A few stepped closer, blinking through the haze. "Good God," one whispered. "Yeah," another said softly. "God's the only thing it didn't hit." That was the birth of its legend, its first blood. Word traveled fast. Reports came in from the Pacific, the North African sands, the mountains of Europe. Every time the M2 appeared, the fight ended differently. In the air, it knocked planes from the sky. On the ground, it erased ambushes before they began. Commanders started calling it the equalizer. Enemies called it something else, the American scythe. Then came the great stage of all, the Second World War. In North Africa, under the blistering sun, Allied convoys rumbled across open desert. German reconnaissance aircraft circled like vultures, searching for movement. And there, mounted on the backs of trucks, the M2s waited. When the planes dived, they met fire. The gunner's world became vibration and smoke, deafened by the voice of the machine. Each tracer carved a glowing path through the air. Metal met metal in an instant of brilliant, terrible geometry. Wings sheared, engines caught fire, and the sky filled with black trails spiraling down to sand. The weapon proved what Browning had always known. Reliability was power. Even when jammed with dust, even under impossible heat, it kept firing. Soldiers came to trust it more than their own rifles. They gave it nicknames. Deuce, Old Reliable, the Hammer. Every name touched with affection and fear. But the most haunting stories came from Europe. The winter of 1944, the Ardennes. Snow draped the forests white, muffling the world, hiding death under beauty. The American troops dug in, shivering, exhausted. Somewhere ahead, German tanks crept through the mist. The soldiers could hear the growl of engines, the grind of treads. Closer, closer. Then the sergeant shouted, "Get the 50 ready!" They swung the Browning onto its mount, linked the heavy belts, and waited. The first tank appeared through the fog, and the M2 answered. Its sound cut through snow like a scream through a prayer. Sparks bloomed against armor, hatches slammed shut, infantry scattered. Another tank flanked left. The gun turned with it, unstoppable, steady as a lighthouse beam of fire. The roar did not stop until the horizon burned orange. When morning came, the air still smelled of metal and oil. The barrels were scorched, the gunners' faces blackened with soot. One soldier later wrote home, "It's like holding the wrath of God in your hands, and once it starts, you don't want to let go." That was what set the Browning apart, not just its destructive force, but the strange, terrifying trust it inspired. In war, everything fails. Plans, courage, hope. But not this. Not the M2. From that winter forward, it became more than a weapon. It was a rhythm, a heartbeat in the chaos. The soldiers learned its song, the deep-throated roar that could turn fear into control. Sometimes at night, when the front went quiet, the men would sit around fires, listening to the distant echoes of other battles. Someone would say, half joking, half proud, "Hear that? Deuce is singing again." The rest would nod, warmed not by fire, but by that knowledge, that somewhere out there, the machine still spoke for them. John Browning was long gone, but his voice had found a new body. And on every battlefield it touched, from the jungles of the Pacific to the ruins of Europe, the result was always the same. When the M2 Browning spoke, the world went silent. The sky was never meant to burn. Yet over Europe in 1943, it did, every day. Dawn lifted over France like the slow raising of a curtain, unveiling clouds streaked with engine smoke and vapor. Far below, cities slept under the weight of war, and above them came the American bombers, silver giants, their wings glittering in pale light. Each B-17 Flying Fortress carried 10 Browning M2s, 500 rounds apiece, and a crew that prayed the guns would sing louder than the Germans screamed. The men called their aircraft by names painted in bright, hopeful colors: Memphis Belle, Lucky Lady, Missouri Gal. All of them carried the same heartbeat, the thud and thunder of Browning guns mounted in every blister and turret, each one a promise that they might see another sunrise. Then, like hawks out of a storm, the Luftwaffe came. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts burst through the clouds with engines howling, diving toward the bomber formations in glittering streaks of silver and gray. They attacked in waves, disciplined, fearless, precise. The Americans saw them through glass sights, specks that grew larger until they filled the world. "Bandits! 9 o'clock high!" The intercom crackled, and that was when the M2s began to roar. The sound inside the bomber was its own battlefield. The twin Brownings in the nose opened first, spraying long chains of fiery tracer rounds into the sky. The sides joined in. The tail turret came alive. Every gunner hunched over his weapon, eyes narrowed, body vibrating with each burst. The whole aircraft trembled like a living thing, its rivets singing in rhythm with the guns. Fire streaked through the air, glowing lines slicing clouds apart. To the German pilots diving from above, the scene below looked like the gates of hell opening. Each bomber spat a lattice of red light, hundreds of rounds every minute spinning into a deadly web. A single burst from an M2 could shatter a fuselage. A well-aimed volley could turn a Messerschmitt into dust within seconds. In the heat of the battle, the gunners didn't aim anymore. They felt. Someone once said you didn't fire a Browning, you unleashed it. The weapon had its own rhythm, a mechanical pulse so steady you could almost time your heartbeat to it. Gunners learned to read the tracers as music, long cords of red light climbing into the blue, then vanishing behind a cloud and returning in thunder. Every hit on a Luftwaffe aircraft was a flash of orange, a trail of smoke tumbling toward the earth. But death came both ways. One bomber, struck amidships, spiraled down, flames licking its wings. In the chaos, another gunner screamed into his headset, "They're everywhere!" To which his commander replied, steady but strained, "Then give 'em hell." The Brownings did exactly that. For hours, the sky screamed. When the formations finally turned homeward, half the aircraft bore scars, punctured tails, broken plexiglass, soot-streaked fuselages, yet many returned. Not because of armor or luck, but because of the guns that never failed. Decades later, surviving airmen would say it the same way every time: "The Browning saved us." On the ground, German officers began taking note. Their pilots reported watching wings shred apart under the M2's fire. Entire strafing runs aborted at the first crack of its voice. In confidential memos, one Luftwaffe colonel called it a relentless saw cutting the air itself. The phrase spread through the ranks like prophecy. It was the first war in which air and fire became one, where human reflexes met mechanical inevitability. The Browning turned bombers into fortresses, giving flesh and courage a fighting chance against speed and fear. By 1944, the sound of the .50 caliber had become as recognizable as the wail of sirens below. Civilians in German cities learned to tell the difference, the deep, ragged growl of anti-aircraft fire, and the cleaner, steadier hammer of Browning's far above. Many said it was worse because it did not stumble. It sounded certain. That certainty was what made the gun terrifying. It never hesitated, never paused to doubt. You could hate it, you could fear it, but you couldn't stop it. When the sky finally fell silent over Europe in 1945, the ruins bore witness to that certainty. The Browning M2 had sculpted the soundscape of war, the brutal harmony of human invention against gravity, hope against vengeance. It was said in jest that American planes flew on two things, gasoline and Browning guns. But beneath the laughter lay truth. The weapon gave wings to resolve. It turned men into hunters among storms. And somewhere, in the thunder and the smoke, one could almost imagine John Browning himself, watching quietly as his creation took the war he never lived to see and shaped its ending. When the sky fell, it was not only bombs that rained down, it was history. And it came screaming to earth through the barrels of the M2. It started as a whisper among the snow-covered trenches of the Eastern Front. A new name, short, sharp, heavy with dread. Waffen des Teufels, the devil's weapon. At first, no one dared to write it down. Soldiers used it half in jest, half in fear, telling stories of American guns that could split a tree in two or punch holes through armored half-tracks. But the joke never lasted long, because those who heard the M2's voice in battle never laughed again. In the ruins of France, a young German lieutenant pressed his face against the cold steel of a panzer hatch, eyes scanning the tree line. He had heard that sound before, once, in Africa, when an Allied convoy ambushed his unit. A sound that did not roll like thunder or crack like rifles. It shredded, it sawed, and somewhere in that shrill metallic growl, he swore he could hear the devil breathe. The German military loved precision. Everything was measured, every weapon catalogued by caliber, range, and rate of fire. Yet, when it came to the American .50 caliber, words failed even the engineers. Reports described it as exceptional, mechanically flawless, disturbingly efficient. A field captain wrote, "It chews through steel with the precision of a craftsman and the rage of hell." Thus the nickname took hold, not born from propaganda, but from respect. By 1944, entire Wehrmacht units had begun to identify the Browning M2 by sound alone. Veterans could tell it apart from any Allied weapon before a single round struck. "It begins low," one survivor recalled, "like distant thunder, then climbs higher, faster, until it becomes a scream. The sound makes your teeth hurt." Prisoners of war told Allied interrogators they feared the .50 caliber more than tanks. Some claimed it fired through trees. Others said it cut through soldiers in trenches. Myths multiplied like shadows, and in every retelling, the gun became more than metal. It became a presence. Soldiers swore it stalked them, its roar rolling across the battlefield long after the fight was done. In the dead silence before dawn, men would wake sweating, convinced they heard it again, the staccato chain of steel teeth gnawing at the edge of memory. German intelligence officers even ordered field tests to replicate the weapon's sound, hoping to desensitize troops before contact. The attempt failed. The real thing was different, deeper, angrier, almost alive. No record could capture that vibration in the bones, that strange mixture of mechanical rhythm and animal fury. The Browning's voice did not echo, it lingered. Its effect went beyond numbers. Morale reports from the Western Front showed entire squads abandoning positions after hearing repeated .50 caliber fire. They believed it was artillery, one historian later wrote. But it wasn't the size of the weapon. It was the certainty behind each shot, the merciless precision that crushed hope faster than bullets crushed steel. In the psychological theater of war, fear is ammunition, and few weapons in history fired it as effectively as the M2. The Germans, who prided themselves on their own engineering marvels, the MG-42, the Panzer tank, the V-2 rocket, found themselves haunted by a simple American design that refused to fail. Captured German correspondents told the same story. "It has no weakness," one sergeant wrote after Normandy. "Whatever god the Americans pray to, he lends his hand to that gun." To the gunners who wielded it, the Browning became both savior and burden. They felt the raw trust placed in its steel, the unshakable expectation that it would roar when needed. And roar it did, in snow, in dust, in storm. It never jammed. It never hesitated. The soldiers began to joke that even the devil had to ask permission before stepping near it. What the Germans called Waffen des Teufels, the devil's weapon, the Americans simply called Deuce. The contrast was poetic. A mother's nickname for the child the enemy swore was born in hell. 2 names, 1 truth. By the end of the war, both sides understood it. The M2 Browning had transcended nations. It was no longer a piece of US equipment. It was a law of the battlefield, as inevitable as fire, gravity, and fear. Because the devil doesn't always roar in darkness. Sometimes he speaks through steel, through craft, through the perfect rhythm of a weapon that never stops. And when that rhythm echoed across Europe, men on both sides looked to the sky and whispered, not to God, but to the man who had built it. John Browning's creation had earned its darkest name. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe was a furnace. Fronts shifted like tides. Bodies froze beneath banners that had already changed hands 6 times. In the storm between empires, one sound cut through everything, low, rhythmic, inhuman. The distinct thunder of the Browning M2. It was no longer just a weapon. It was the spine of the Allied advance. In the Ardennes, when the German counteroffensive surged from the snow like a wounded monster, American convoys struggled to hold their ground. Tanks burned, trees splintered, men dug in, waiting for armor that never came. But they had one constant, the .50 caliber, perched atop every jeep, truck, and half-track like an avenging sentinel. When German infantry crept through the fog, the M2 greeted them first. Its first burst ripped the silence apart, each round carving a path through the haze. The soldiers on the receiving end learned too late that there was no cover thick enough. Fences, walls, even metal plating shredded under the hail of fiery slugs. The Browning's voice echoed off the frozen hills, a beating heart of defiance that rallied the weary and terrified. Reports from the Battle of the Bulge described it in simple terms. It stopped them. A single gun, mounted on the back of a truck, could hold an entire road. Its tracers painted lines of red fire across the trees, illuminating silhouettes in the snow. When ammunition belts ran out, gunners burned their gloves reloading. Their hands blistered black, but they didn't stop. "It felt like the gun was alive," one veteran said. "You just fed it, and it took care of the rest." That, perhaps, was its most terrifying trait, its endurance. The M2 could sustain fire long after others failed. Its barrel, glowing orange, still spat truth and heat. Its rhythm never changed, not faster, not slower, a metronome of destruction. In those desperate hours, soldiers believed that as long as Deuce kept firing, no enemy could cross that line. And often, they were right. As Allied forces pushed through France into Germany, the weapon became both spear and shield. Mounted on tanks, it cleared ambushes before infantry ever stepped in. Mounted on aircraft, it carved open railroads, convoys, and bridges with surgical defiance. Mounted on naval decks, it turned the night sea into sparks and echoes. There was no front safe from its reach. Enemy morale began to break not under bombs or artillery, but under the sound that meant annihilation was close. In declassified field reports, German officers lamented that their troops refused to engage when American .50 calibers opened up. One commander wrote bitterly, "Our courage melts before it roars." The M2 didn't merely kill, it dictated behavior. It could turn offense into retreat, discipline into panic. Commanders noticed a strange pattern. Wherever Browning guns were deployed, soldiers stood their ground longer, advanced faster, and died less often. Fear had been reversed. What the enemy once used against the Allies, intimidation, psychological dominance, had been turned back on them with mechanical precision. The Browning's roar became more than noise. It was a signal, a declaration across the battlefield. We are still here, and we are not moving. In Italy, crews mounted them on rooftops to sweep snipers from ancient stone towers. In Normandy, they mowed through hedgerows that hid machine gun nests. In the Pacific, they tore through jungle ambushes, their rounds cutting through palm trunks thicker than a man's leg. Wherever soldiers faced the unknown, the M2 answered. The Allies didn't just win through strategy or numbers, they won through rhythm. A terrifying, steady rhythm that carried across valleys and airfields, reminding both sides that American steel still drew breath. The roar of battle had changed pitch, and in that change lay victory. Later, historians would point to technology, production, logistics, the usual reasons wars are won. But among the men who bled, the explanation was simpler. One said it during an interview decades after the smoke had cleared. That gun gave you faith. Not in God, not in officers, in sound. You knew it. You felt it. When it spoke, you knew we could hold. The turning of the tide wasn't a moment. It was a frequency. Deep, mechanical, unwavering. The frequency of survival. The frequency of the Browning M2. War has many sounds. The shriek of shells, the whisper of wind past a ruined church, the soft click of a rifle bolt closing on a prayer. But among them all, one sound stood apart, the deep, stuttering roar of the Browning M2. Not sharp like a pistol, not chattering like a submachine gun. It was heavier, slower, deliberate, a voice that seemed to roll straight out of the molten heart of the earth. You didn't just hear it, you felt it. Veterans would describe it differently, as thunder with teeth, as chains grinding through steel, as an invisible saw cutting the fabric of reality itself. But they all agreed on one thing. When the M2 began to sing, everything else fell silent. In the chaos of battle, sound is survival. Your brain measures direction, distance, rhythm. You learn to tell an MG42 from an MP40, friendly fire from foe. But the Browning broke that instinct. Its sound carried across entire valleys, echoing off stone and fog, defying location or meaning. Soldiers couldn't tell whether it came from the hill ahead, the trench beside them, or the heavens above. To the enemy, that uncertainty was unbearable. Because the M2 didn't fire in panic, it fired with intention. Each burst was measured, ruthless, mathematical. It was not frenzy, it was judgment. It sounded like finality itself. Psychologists who studied battlefield trauma after the war spoke of it often, how the distinctive tone of the Browning triggered reactions long after peace returned. Men who had survived artillery, bombings, and tanks would shudder at recordings of those heavy, rhythmic bursts. One veteran admitted he could not listen to a Harley-Davidson engine without sweating. The pitch was too close. The gun's sound lived in memory like a specter. It was the perfect psychological weapon, an accident born from perfection. John Browning had designed every spring and lever for efficiency. He never meant to craft a voice of fear. Yet when metal, fire, and recoil united, they produced a timbre so unique that it bypassed the brain and struck straight at the spine. Even among its own crews, the sound carried reverence. Gunners spoke of the weapon as if it were a living creature. "You could hear it breathe," said one airman who manned a waist turret over Berlin. "When the belts fed right, it purred. When it jammed, rarely, it groaned. But when it sang full, you felt safe. You were inside its song." That song was a paradox. To those behind it, comfort. To those before it, damnation. Enemy infantry came to know it instantly. That booming, deliberate rhythm that punctured the air like a hammer on a cathedral bell. Some froze the moment they heard it. Others scattered blindly, seeking cover where none existed. It killed more with terror than with bullets. In the Pacific, the effect was even worse. Jungle warfare meant sound ruled everything. You never saw the shooter, only the rippling explosion of leaves and wood as the M2 tore paths through green shadows. Japanese soldiers gave it another name, the Shinigami's breath, the breath of the death spirit. Sound travels faster than fear, but in those jungles, they met halfway. Even animals fled from it. Birds vanished minutes before the first shot. Dogs, both friendly and enemy handlers, refused to go near mounted Browning positions. Nature itself seemed to react, as if the vibration unsettled not just air, but instinct. Scientists later measured that low, thudding cadence. The frequency sat in the same range as a human heartbeat, just slower, deeper. When you were close enough, the resonance entered your body. It made your ribs vibrate. It blurred thought. You became part of the sound whether you wished to or not. That was the genius and horror of the symphony. Unintended, perfect, inescapable. When the war ended, silence did not return easily. Cities rebuilt, skies cleared, uniforms were stored away. But the echo lingered in men's heads. It became part of them, pulsing in their dreams. A veteran once described hearing the Browning again during a thunderstorm decades later. "For a second, I wasn't old. I was there. The smell of gun oil, the scream of engines, and the roar, always the roar. It doesn't fade. It just waits for quiet." Because the M2 Browning never belonged only to the battlefield. It belonged to memory, to the primal corner of the human mind that remembers what power feels like and what fear sounds like. Even today, if you stand close to one being fired, your chest will tighten before your mind understands why. It's not volume, it's something older, that ancient instinct that tells you when you're hearing the voice of a predator. For the men of World War II, that voice had a name. It had a rhythm. And like all great music, once it began, it could not be ignored. The symphony of fear had found its conductor, the M2 Browning, the sound that kills. The war ended, but the M2 didn't. When the last shells fell silent in 1945, and the soldiers of every nation stumbled home to ruin and silence, one machine refused to rest. It stood guard at airfields, aboard ships, mounted on still smoking tanks, its barrel dark and patient, not yet done with history. The Browning M2 had outlived its war, and in doing so, it began its transformation from weapon to legend. At first, it survived simply because it worked. The world rebuilt, armies rearmed, and new conflicts dawned before peace even had a chance to breathe. The Cold War drew borders across continents, and once again, men reached out for the gun that never failed. It appeared in Korea, its same steel heart beating beneath frost and rain. The year was 1951. Frozen hills, endless nights. Chinese soldiers advanced in silence, ghostly and fearless. And then, as before, the M2 opened its throat. The sound echoed off the mountains, rolling down the valleys like thunder chained to earth. Afterward, veterans said it was the only thing that kept the night from swallowing them. Then came Vietnam, the humid inferno where every shadow could shoot back. American bases glimmered with floodlights and noise, and from every perimeter came the heartbeat of the old Browning. Mounted on gun trucks and helicopters, it poured incandescent rain into the jungle. Its recoil shook the frames of aircraft. Its barrels glowed white-hot, but it kept going, as if nothing on earth could age it. It became more than a weapon. It became a presence. Photographers captured its silhouette against sunsets over rice fields. Journalists wrote its name with reverence or accusation. The 50 caliber Deuce, the American handshake. In cinema, it roared across screens, defining the sound of modern warfare. That deep, chugging voice echoed from every conflict that followed, from Desert Storm to the mountains of Afghanistan. It became the soundtrack of supremacy, the symbol of reach and dominance. Its outline appeared on posters, t-shirts, and even tattoos. The long barrel, the heavy cradle, unmistakable, eternal. But the legend carried weight beyond iconography. Soldiers trusted it like family. Mechanics swore by it. Some claimed they would rather fight without food than without a functioning 50. Every new generation of warfare brought new technologies, satellites, drones, guided missiles, and yet the Browning remained, unchanged. The same design that John Moses Browning sketched in the early 20th century still guarded convoys in the 21st. A century for a machine, and not just any machine, one that never pretended to be elegant or merciful or glamorous. Its perfection lay in honesty. It did one thing, and it did it without compromise. That simplicity is what made it immortal. Weapons come and go. The MGs, the Stens, the Uzis, all celebrated, all eventually replaced. But the M2 still stands, its bronze plate stamped with a date that feels almost prehistoric now. To touch one is to shake hands with history itself. For soldiers, it became myth through repetition. For the enemy, through fear. For historians, through numbers. But for those who lived beside it, who cleaned it, carried it, trusted it, the M2 became something spiritual. It was the last bridge between man and machine, where trust didn't rely on code or circuit, only on craftsmanship and respect. Even now, in distant deserts and forgotten outposts, the Browning's shadow stretches long. It isn't just mounted on a tripod anymore, it's mounted in memory. Every time it fires, its voice carries across eras, from Normandy to Quezon, from Mosul to Kabul, connecting generations of soldiers who never met but heard the same rhythm in the distance. And so, a thing of steel became a symbol of endurance, not of war's glory, but of its permanence. John Browning had never meant to create a monument, yet he did. His weapon was not a statue or a speech, but a sound that could cut through time itself, raw, mechanical, infinite. The world built new guns, smarter and sleeker, but none replaced the old 50. It remains a reminder of something rarely achieved, human creation that reached mechanical perfection. Every legend starts with fear, then becomes respect, and ends as myth. The M2 Browning walked all three paths, from the forges of Utah to the skies of Europe, from the jungles of Asia to the deserts of the Middle East. Its echo never stopped traveling. From steel, it became symbol. From symbol, memory. And from memory, eternity. Time changes everything. Uniforms, flags, names of enemies and allies. Yet one thing still burns where others fade. The flash of the Browning M2's fire. More than 100 years have passed since John Browning first drew its outline in graphite and oil. Empires have crumbled. Technology has sprinted ahead. Satellites now orbit above the same Earth where men once crawled through trenches. But in the heart of every modern battlefield, somewhere beneath the drones and digital screens, the same old rhythm still echoes. That deep, measured roar of the .50 caliber. It has seen everything. It fought in the frozen valleys of Korea, where the air itself cracked from cold and bullets glowed like comets in the night. It thundered across the jungles of Vietnam, clearing paths through green chaos. It guarded convoys in the deserts of Iraq, thundered from Humvees in Afghanistan, and even today, it sits mounted on watchtowers facing horizons made of dust and waiting. Technologies changed. The soldiers did not. Every generation that met the Browning spoke the same words. It never fails. Those 3 syllables became its creed. New weapons came and went, lighter, faster, louder, yet none replaced it. Engineers tried to redesign, to modernize, to make it more efficient, and almost every time they returned to the original. Because perfection doesn't need improvement, it only needs maintenance. Its fire has illuminated every age since 1918. The M2 became a thread woven through the fabric of modern war, a silent observer watching humanity repeat its oldest habits. In black and white photographs, it appears staring across no man's land. In color footage, it gleams in desert sun. It has witnessed the birth of radio, jet engines, computers, and the internet. It has outlived the men who built it, the factories that forged it, even the ideas it once defended. And yet, it remains. Reliable as sunrise, unforgiving as winter. For soldiers who trained with it, the weapon's roar became a sound of continuity, proof that someone, somewhere on their side, still stood guard. For historians, it became a strange comfort, evidence that even in destruction, humanity could build something enduring, something so functional that it transcended the chaos it perpetuated. There is a cruel poetry in that. The same weapon that tore apart skies now guards convoys bringing relief to disaster zones. The same cartridge that once brought fear now fires warning shots over borders to deter violence. The Browning has shifted roles, changed faces, from tool of war to tool of deterrence, and still, inside its steel heart, the same pulse beats. In museums, children press their hands against its cold frame, eyes wide as guides speak of the old .50. They don't hear the thunder anymore. They see metal, silent, harmless. Yet those who remember can still close their eyes and recall the sound, the steady rhythm, the vibration through earth and bone, the symphony of power controlled by human hands. That is the fire through the ages, not the muzzle flash, but the continuity of will. The proof that invention, once born of war, can survive longer than war itself. John Browning could never have imagined the places his creation would reach. It crossed continents, languages, and ideologies, serving under monarchs, democracies, and insurgencies alike. It became a paradox, a weapon built by one mind, adopted by all, loved and feared by enemies alike. Because some machines belong not to nations, but to the century that made them. Every age finds its own reflection in the M2. To the soldier, it's safety. To the historian, legacy. To the philosopher, irony. To the enemy, inevitability. Each sees something different in its glare, but all see truth, the enduring fire of human creation. And so, even as the world hurtles toward drones and lasers, the M2 Browning remains unchanged, a steel metronome keeping time with the heartbeat of human conflict. The fire has not gone out, it simply changed hands. And as long as there are wars to fight or fears to keep at bay, somewhere, someone will listen to that familiar roar and whisper the same words spoken a century ago. It will do. Metals are supposed to rust. Time devours everything, from the marble of empires to the bones of kings. Yet somehow, The Browning M2 refused, not just in function, but in meaning. Generation after generation, it weathered storms of history and emerged untouched, as though memory itself had chosen to preserve it. You can trace the story of modern war through the smoke-stained silhouette of this single weapon. Its design is simple: a tube, a bolt, a spring, a soul forged in Utah steel. But within that simplicity lies a strange defiance of mortality. The soldiers who once fed its belts are gone, their voices fading into the static of documentaries and interviews. But the machine they trusted remains the same, unchanged from the day John Browning's hands left it behind. New models bear fresh serial numbers, but inside them beats the same heart, the same mathematics of recoil and precision, the same whisper of genius. It is proof that immortality in the modern age does not belong to men. It belongs to what they build. The M2 became, in every sense, living history. When future generations train with it, they unknowingly touch the fingerprints of soldiers long dead. The weapon is a bridge, linking Normandy to Kandahar, the Ardennes to Fallujah. The same rhythm, the same roar, the same vibration that once shook the skies of Europe now echoes across deserts half a world away. Some call that irony. Others call it sacred continuity. Every time its trigger is pulled, the past flares alive for a heartbeat. For a fraction of a second, Browning's century-old vision burns through gunpowder smoke, a ghost reminding the living that progress and destruction have always marched together. There is something almost human about its endurance. It mirrors us, stubborn, adaptable, unwilling to surrender. Humanity built this machine to survive battle. But in doing so, it captured something of itself. Its endurance became a reflection of our own craving for permanence, for legacy, for the illusion that we, too, can outlast time if we build well enough. Even silence cannot bury it. Walk through any veterans museum and watch the way old soldiers pause before it, not out of nostalgia, but out of recognition. They reach out, fingertips grazing cold steel, remembering not just what it did, but what it meant. The metallic chill on their skin is memory made tangible, grief made holy. The M2 has become a language between generations, a whisper between those who fought and those who only study their courage. It reminds both that invention is not innocent, that genius, when given purpose, can outlive morality. There are monuments of stone dedicated to peace and freedom, yet few will last as long as this weapon. Statues crumble, flags fade. But somewhere, a Browning sits oiled and ready, its mechanism waiting for the breath of life from another human hand. That is immortality in its most unsettling form, not the defiance of death, but the persistence of utility. When engineers examine the M2 today, they marvel at its balance. No wasted part, no redundant motion. They speak in admiration, perhaps envy, of such flawless simplicity. Some whisper that no modern machine is built to last a century anymore, that perfection, once achieved, frightened the world into progress without permanence. John Browning's greatest creation did not just conquer enemies, it conquered time. His weapon is both relic and revelation, a ghost that breathes, a drumbeat that refuses to stop. It stands as testament to what the human mind can craft when driven by obsession and precision, but also a warning that once born, some creations never truly die. Steel, after all, does not forget. It carries fingerprints in its molecules, vibrations in its shell. Every bullet it ever fired left a microscopic scar, a record written in heat, memory etched in metal. One day, the world may finally outgrow war. The soldiers may return home for good, the arsenals left to dust. And when that happens, the last remaining M2 will rest in some forgotten corner of a museum, silent yet watchful, And even then, anyone standing before it will feel something unspoken, the weight of immortality. Because immortality doesn't wear a crown or a halo. Sometimes it wears a serial number and smells faintly of oil and history. Long after the last shell has fallen silent, the echo remains, not in the sky, not in the ground, in us. For a century, the M2 Browning has sung its mechanical hymn across the world's battlefields. It has cut through jungle, desert, ice, and wind. It has defended cities, destroyed convoys, and outlived the hands that aimed it. Yet it is not the weapon itself that endures the longest. It is what it reveals about us, the makers. Every shot from its barrel was a word in a long conversation between man and machine. A dialogue that began the day John Browning first looked at a piece of steel and saw more than metal. He saw reflection. He once said that design was a kind of faith, that a perfect mechanism could approach truth. And he came closer than most. His creation became a mirror that magnified the soul of its era, precise, ambitious, relentless, unashamed of power. The M2 is not evil, nor virtuous. It is an answer to a question humanity keeps asking. How far can we shape the world with our will? Every trigger pulled is that question repeated, and every echo is the same bleak reply. This is how far. But even as it roars, something more subtle stirs beneath the noise. The pulse of creators who cannot bear to stop creating, even when their works destroy. The M2 became the ultimate symbol of that paradox, an artifact of brilliance born from fear, wielded by both tyranny and freedom, its morality changing only with who held its grip. In that duality lies its immortality, and our own. For all its steel and precision, the M2 behaves like something alive. It hungers for motion, depends on touch, breathes through recoil. In battle, it becomes an extension of the man behind it, his heartbeat, his pulse, his terror, until it's impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. The soldier who fires it feels that unity. The rhythm of the gun synchronizes with his body. The noise deafens language, leaving only instinct. And in that moment, the boundary between creation and creator dissolves. That is the true echo of war, not the ringing of ears, but the merging of intention and consequence until they are indistinguishable. No one who has worked beside the Browning forgets that sensation. Some describe it as empowerment, others, possession. All agree it changes you. Because once you've commanded that much force with a single finger, you can never fully believe in peace again. When historians write of the 20th century, they speak of ideologies, battles, treaties. But beneath those, invisible, hums the deeper story, the story of the human machine. The mind that dreamed, built, refined, and released the tools that redefined death itself. We build machines thinking they will serve us, yet the longer they last, the more their reflection shapes us. The Browning endures not only because it works, but because it reminds us of what perfection, once found, demands: endless use. So the echo continues, on firing ranges, in distant conflicts, and inside the memories of those who once stood near its voice. Even silent, it speaks. Its mere presence hums with everything we've learned and everything we still haven't. Its sound is a question that will not fade. If we can make things that never die, why can't we stop killing? No answer ever comes. Only the steady rhythm of time passing. One more heartbeat, one more echo. In the end, that is what the M2 Browning truly became. The echo of war made flesh, the sound of human ingenuity outlasting human mercy. It is our masterpiece and our shadow, our triumph and our confession. And as long as its barrel still glints beneath sunlight somewhere on Earth, It will whisper across the ages, a voice of fire and metal, carrying a truth as old as creation itself. The machine was always human. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. There are more amazing stories to come. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.